It usually starts with something small, a comment made in passing, a joke that doesn't ask for attention. Someone says, "Well, that's just how it goes." And there's a familiar ripple of laughter. Not big laughter, the kind that barely lifts the shoulders, the kind that says, "We recognize this moment." I've noticed how often those jokes appear right when something tender is nearby, a hope that didn't quite make it into language, a possibility that feels risky to touch directly. The joke steps in first like a polite intermediary, smoothing the edges so no one has to sit too long with uncertainty. What's interesting isn't that the joke exists. Humor is ancient, it's intelligent, it keeps us human. What's interesting is how complete some jokes feel, how final, as if they arrived already finished, already agreed upon. Sometimes I laugh and then realize a moment later that I don't quite know why I did. The sound came out before the curiosity had time to arrive. And in that tiny delay, something opens. It's not dramatic, it's more like noticing that the floor you're standing on is slightly less solid than you assumed. Just enough to make you pause, just enough to wonder what you're standing on exactly. And the ordinary moment keeps going. Kettle boiling, phones buzzing, someone changing the subject, while that quiet question stays in the corner, patient, like it isn't in a hurry to be answered.
I've been paying attention to that pause as well. The moment after the laugh, when the room has technically moved on, but something hasn't quite caught up yet, almost like an echo that doesn't belong to the sound that made it. Humor has a strange authority, not because it's loud or persuasive, but because it rarely needs defending. A joke doesn't argue its case, it assumes you're already there. And if you are, the laugh comes easily. If you're not, there's often a flicker of discomfort. Not because the joke is offensive, but because it asks you to stand somewhere you're no longer sure that you occupy. What fascinates me is how often jokes act as conclusions, disguised as commentary. They sound observational, but they function as endings. They quietly close a loop. They say, "This is settled." And there's relief in that. Endings are tidy. They let us rest. They spare us the effort of staying curious in places where curiosity feels expensive. I'm not interested in taking humor away. I'm interested in noticing where it quietly takes the possibility off the table, not by force, but by familiarity. It's almost elegant, really. A smile, a line, a laugh, and a whole philosophy gets reinforced without debate. No speeches, no proof, just the comfort of, we all know.
There's a particular flavour of humour I recognise instantly now. It's gentle, self aware, almost charming. It shows that when someone mentions wanting something that hasn't been easy for them before, money, love, ease, belonging, the joke arrives quickly as if to say, "Don't worry, I'm not serious." And everyone relaxes. The atmosphere stays light. No one has to recalibrate how real the desire might be. I understand why it happens. Sincerity changes the temperature of a room. It asks for a presence. A joke keeps the air thin. But I've also noticed that people almost never joke about outcomes they quietly believe are still possible. There's a reverence there, an unspoken sense that laughing would be premature, that humour might bruise something still forming. So the jokes cluster elsewhere, around places where expectation has hardened into certainty, where disappointment has already been metabolized into wit. But that isn't a failure, that's actually an adaptation. But adaptation can quietly turn into identity if no one's paying attention. And sometimes without any intention at all, that identity announces itself as a punchline. If you listen closely, the joke is often saying, I'm loyal to the old story, not because it's true, but because it's familiar, and familiarity can feel like love.
It's worth noticing how social humor is. It's fairly solitary. Even when we joke alone, we're usually imagining an audience, a familiar nod, a shared understanding. Laughter is one of the fastest ways to establish belonging. When people laugh together, they're not just sharing amusement, they're aligning. They're confirming that they see the world from roughly the same angle, at least for that moment. And belonging is powerful. We'll often trade a surprising amount of openness to maintain it. I've seen rooms where a certain kind of optimism simply isn't welcome, not because anyone says so, but because the jokes land differently when it appears. A raised eyebrow, a soft chuckle, a subtle signal that this isn't how we talk here. No one's being cruel. No one is enforcing rules. The humor does the work quietly, efficiently. What's curious is how invisible that process can be from the inside. It feels like personality, like realism, like having a sense of humor about life. Until one day, perhaps, the joke stops feeling funny and you realize it's been doing more work than you gave it credit for.
I've started to notice that some jokes function like old coats. They're comfortable, they're familiar, a little warm, but still recognizable. You reach for them without thinking because they've always been there. They fit the version of you that learned how to survive a particular climate. And then occasionally you put one on and realize that it doesn't quite sit right anymore. The shoulders feel tight, the sleeves are shorter than you remember. Nothing wrong with the coat at all. It just belongs to a different season. And that moment can feel oddly disorientating. You tell the joke and the laugh arrives late, or it arrives but without conviction. The words come out, but something inside you doesn't quite stand behind them anymore. I find that moment interesting because it doesn't announce itself as change. It feels more like confusion, like forgetting the next line of a script you've performed 1,000 times. There's often a temptation to rush past it, to patch the gap with another joke, another form, another layer of irony, something to restore fluency. But if you don't, if you let the pause linger, something quietly honest shows itself. You begin to see what that humour was keeping intact, what version of yourself it was loyal to, and whether that loyalty still makes any sense. Sometimes the pause feels like standing at a doorway you didn't plan to open. You're not sure what's on the other side, only that the old room suddenly feels a little bit too small.
That pause, the one Lynn's pointing to, has a particular texture. It's not dramatic silence, it's more like the absence of reflex. The moment when the body hasn't quite decided what to do next. Most of us are very fluent in our own patterns. We know how to respond before the thought finishes forming. Humor is one of the smoothest of these responses. Efficient, elegant, socially rewarded. So when a joke doesn't complete itself, it can feel like a malfunction, as if something's gone wrong with the system. But I don't think it's malfunction. I think it's recalibration. Certainly, for all its limitations, it's very good at its job. It offers predictability, it keeps expectations manageable, it gives us something solid to lean against, and humor often serves, certainly beautifully. It repeats it without heaviness and it makes it palatable. Possibility is different. Possibility doesn't have muscle memory. Possibility doesn't know its lines yet. So when possibility begins to re enter a place that certainty once occupied, the jokes tied to that certainty often lose their footing, not because they're false, but because they're no longer complete. And when something is no longer complete, you can't hide behind it. You have to meet the moment as it is, unfinished, slightly awkward, and strangely alive.
What I appreciate about this is how unheroic it is. There's no announcement, there's no identity shift, no moment when someone declares, I believe differently now. It happens much more quietly. A joke you've always told feels thin. A familiar laugh feels unnecessary. A comment you normally make makes stays unspoken, and for a moment you don't replace it. That moment can feel strangely exposed. Humor is a kind of social armor. When it drops away, even briefly, you're left more visible to yourself as much as to others. But there's also a kind of relief in that exposure, a sense that you don't have to perform your expectations anymore, that you can leave a sentence unfinished, let a thought hover. I've noticed that people sometimes mistake this phase for becoming serious or heavy or earnest, but that's not how it feels from the inside. It feels lighter, if anything, less obliged to deliver a conclusion, and almost playful in a different way, like discovering that not everything needs a punchline to be complete. It's the playfulness of not rushing to label the moment, or letting life be a little ambiguous without treating ambiguity as danger.
There's something quietly radical about letting a belief remain unreinforced. Most of what we call fixed in our lives isn't held in place by dramatic decisions, it's held in place by repetition, by tone, by what we casually agree with again and again. Humor is one of the most efficient carriers of that repetition because it bypasses scrutiny. You don't examine a joke, you recognize it, and recognition feels like truth. So when recognition falters, even slightly, the structure starts to loosen, not collapse, loosen. And looseness can feel unsafe if you're used to firm edges. It can feel like standing without a railing, but it can also feel like space. I've noticed that when people stop reinforcing a belief with humor, they don't immediately replace it with something better. There's usually a period of not knowing, of suspended meaning, of mild awkwardness, which culturally we're not very good at. We like clarity, we like resolution, we like things to land, but not everything that matters lands neatly. Some things hover and some things wait. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do is allow the laugh to fade and see what remains when it does. In that hovering, you may discover you're not empty at all. You're simply no longer filling space with the old verdict. And the mind doesn't quite know what to do with that freedom yet.
What's interesting is how little effort any of this requires. There's no need to monitor yourself, no need to correct your humor or upgrade it into something more enlightened. That would miss the point entirely. This isn't about improvement, it's about noticing. Noticing what you laugh at when you're tired. Noticing what slips out when you don't want to disappoint the room. Noticing which laugh feels light and which feels like punctuation marks. I found that awareness alone changes the texture of things. This isn't because it replaces one belief with another, but because it interrupts automatic loyalty. It introduces just enough space for something else to be felt, and that something else is often quieter than we expect. It just doesn't announce itself as optimism or faith or confidence. It feels more like neutrality, like not needing to conclude so quickly. There's a softness to that, a kind of internal permission, almost as if life doesn't need to be summed up every time it speaks. And it's funny, sometimes the moment you stop being realistic as a reflex, You don't become unrealistic. You become available, available to be surprised by your own mind.
I think this is why humor is such an honest diagnostic. Not because it tells us what we consciously believe, but because it reveals where we've stopped negotiating. Negotiation implies openness, movement, a willingness to be surprised. Jokes, especially the familiar ones, often signal the opposite, a quiet decision that this particular conversation is over. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. We can't live in perpetual openness. We need rest. We need shorthand. We need places where things feel settled enough to lean on. But it's worth noticing when settlement becomes stagnation, when shorthand turns into a script that runs even when it no longer fits the moment. I've seen people who think they're being realistic when what they're really being is repetitive. The humor hasn't evolved because the assumption beneath it hasn't been questioned, not challenged, just questioned. And questioning doesn't require answers, it just requires pause. A pause is often enough to reveal whether a belief is still alive or simply familiar. And once you notice the difference, you can't unnotice it. The old joke might still appear, but it arrives with less authority, like a headline you've stopped taking personally.
There's a subtle loneliness that can appear here, and I think it's worth naming. When your humour starts to shift, your sense of belonging can wobble a bit. You may notice that certain laughs don't come as easily, that you're not always standing where the group expects you to be, that a joke meant to bond suddenly feels like a costume you've outgrown. And that can feel unsettling, not because you're becoming different, but because you're becoming less automatic. And yet, there's also a strange intimacy that opens up, a quieter connection with yourself, a sense that you're not required to signal agreement just to stay included. Belonging, it turns out, doesn't always sound like laughter. Sometimes it sounds like silence shared without discomfort. Sometimes it sounds like a question left unanswered. And sometimes it sounds like a love that never arrives. And that's okay. There's a gentler kind of belonging that forms when you don't force the laugh, when you let the room be what it is and let yourself be what you are without the usual performance of, I'm fine.
I don't think change announces itself with certainty. I think it announces itself with hesitation, with moments where the old responses don't quite fire and the new ones haven't formed yet. A missed laugh, a delayed reaction, a joke that lands but doesn't complete. Those moments are easy to overlook, easy to correct, easy to smooth over, but they're also invitations not to do anything, but to notice where you're no longer standing. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the work, if it can be called that, is simply allowing those gaps to exist, letting humor do less work for a while, letting conclusions remain unfinished. After all, certainty rarely needs defending, it just needs repeating. And repetition often sounds like laughter. So when the laughter fades, even briefly, something else has a chance to speak. Not loudly, not clearly, but honestly. And perhaps that honesty doesn't need a punchline at all. Not a final statement, not a tidy moral, just a little more space than you had yesterday. And a quiet sense that what felt settled may still be moving without needing to know why yet.
Before we drift off, if this conversation stayed with you, even in a small way, you might like to let the platform know. Liking the video helps it find people who enjoy thinking quietly. Subscribing means you'll wander back into these conversations with us. Sharing it is simply an invitation, not a recommendation, though. And the bell, that just lets you know when we're here again, wandering out loud. No obligation, no promises. Just an open door if you feel like walking through it. So until next time, think differently, dream boldly, and create consciously.